But first, I'd like to thank the university for inviting me here today, and all of the many partners who've made this possible. And to let you know that what Angus says, where else but Dundee, actually, in my estimation, there are a number of places where this might happen, but it will happen very well here, based on the conversations that I've had with people about the development of the process that you're in the middle of. So some people may recognize these dolls. If you're a life scientist, you will, but some people might not. They are actually dolls that were given away by the Eppendorf company to people buying centrifuges, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. This photograph is taken inside the University of Copenhagen's proteomics lab just before it opened about 2 years ago. So these little creatures are actually rather significant for life scientists, and they might be exciting for artists as well. There are a number of hallmarks to these kinds of meetings of minds across disciplinary divides, and one is that feeling of excitement that you get about other practitioners who share one's interest in looking over the parapet and coming down off the mountain. Another reality is that you don't have a clue who the person speaking actually is or what their experience or knowledge base might be. So I'm going to begin with a little introduction. I have been working as a museum professional, but I also have a career as an artist. And this career over about 30 years spans the Sao Paulo Art Biennale, the New Museum of New York, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, the Institute of Astronomy of Cambridge University, the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Copenhagen, and the Natural History Museum in London, among others. That's quite varied. I have made large-scale site-specific installations. I've published in scholarly journals. I've created exhibitions about biomedicine and about philosophy of science for national museums. I've designed strategy for humanities research programs in science, inside science academies, as you've heard. And I've also run a successful capital fundraising campaign. So I may not be the only grandmother in this room who has sucked a lot of eggs, but we might be telling each other things we already know. So I hope you'll be patient with me if I do that. Anyway, most of you have never heard of me, and in fact, I have never heard of you. So we're actually on equal footing and equally deserving of each other's respect. And that's the basis on which most of these collaborations have taken place, and will be successful if that's the basis. Anyway, many of you will also have participated in and/or initiated projects that span the arts, science, and humanities in one form or another. And I'd like to give you a bird's eye view of one such recent project for which I was the creative director. It's particularly pertinent here today as it has biomedicine at its core. Split and Splice, Fragments from the Age of Biomedicine, was an exhibition about the last 50 years of biomedical practice, which took place at the Medical Museum of the University of Copenhagen. It was highly experimental and approached head-on the almost impossible task of presenting and rendering comprehensible some fundamentally invisible practices that Angus was referring to, such as tiny molecular manipulations and huge intangible databases, numerical databases. Creating the exhibition took over 3 years and involved conjoining and aligning the work and thoughts of biomedical practitioners, historians of science and medicine, museologists, designers, artists, and more. And it paid off. In 2010, this exhibition won the coveted Dibner Award for Excellence in Museum Exhibits of the Society for the History of Technology. This is the only prize internationally for science exhibitions. Other winners, for example, have been the Greenwich Time Galleries in London and the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. So Split and Splice won this award because it was groundbreaking in 2 distinct but intimately connected ways. It produced not only an innovative exhibition about a difficult subject, because biomedicine is a difficult subject, But it also developed a new scholarly methodology for producing exhibitions, a prototype for research collaborations across the disciplines. And it's significant that Split and Splice was created inside a university museum, because universities are really uniquely well placed to hybridize science practice with humanities research methodologies and collections and exhibitions. As a visiting associate professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences and as creative director for the exhibition Split and Splice, it was my job to galvanize and lead a core team of researchers, the biomedical practitioners with whom they were embedded, and the collections of the museum itself. In the exhibition brief, we collectively expressed our aims and some of the methods we hope to employ in order to achieve these aims. So this is a quote directly from the exhibition brief that we collectively wrote. The core aim of the exhibition is to facilitate visitors' informed reflections upon the ways in which recent biomedicine challenges significant cultural categories, including the body and identity, therefore influencing our very understanding of ourselves as human beings, our sense of personhood. In the process of creating the exhibition, we wish to explore the way that both identities and bodies, which are two sides of the same personhood coin, how identities and bodies are produced by current biomedical practice. Produced, but also constituted, re-engineered, collected, circulated, fragmented, generated, extended, hybridized, mediated, suspended, digitized, controlled, and categorized. We wanted to take the general visitor beyond the user end of biomedicine, which they're used to, and into its engine room, and to experiment with innovative ways of bringing some of the big invisibles of biomedical practice to a larger public. Questions of samples and storage, data generation and management, the integration of analytical instruments with research, and also with clinical bureaucracies, the legal frameworks of biomedicine. All of this was on our agenda. We wanted to address the social, political, and cultural enormities of contemporary biomedicine without losing sight of the historical. We didn't so much want to teach people the science. Rather, we wanted to teach people how to think about science, how to think about how bodies are contingent, flexible, fluid, resilient, how the materials, tools, and instruments of biomedicine have a history, how conditions for the production of medical knowledge actually change over time. We took it as a strength that we would have to exchange our skills and knowledge rather than relying on a shared training, such as museum professional practice, for example. The main premise of our development process for the production of the concepts in the exhibition was twofold. On the one hand, we assumed that aesthetics are above all an analytical tool. The other assumption we made was that epistemological inquiry can actually guide what an exhibition ends up looking like. Some of this will sound familiar to you, and other things will be familiar to the person sitting next to you. But that's enough about that. We don't actually have that much time, not just today, but in the world. There are critical issues we face together in the world today, and some of them can only be resolved by collaborative interdisciplinary work. So I'm not going to start at square one. I'm not going to start at drawing as a shared observational tool across the arts and sciences. I'm not going to start with soft references to creativity that fold both artists and scientists into a warm glow. I'm not going to talk about science communication or hair splitting about whether scientific images are art or not. I'm going to talk about methodologies, about impediments to serious collaboration and how to work around them, about infrastructure and how to share it, about how a future could be constructed in which I would like to be working and many of you would like to be working as well. Because what we need now is pragmatic steps we can take to actualize the promise of interdisciplinarity, steps through which we can achieve more than just shotgun weddings between fundable on paper individuals, ways in which we can go beyond armchair philosophizing without trained philosophers, and beyond sci-art one-hit wonders. We need vision at a very high level in our institutions and concrete action from vice-chancellors and directors of research in order to materialize this climate we want to be working in. And they will need the support of major funders, such as the Wellcome Trust. The real challenge is not so much one of scale or even bringing together disparate material and material culture from labs, studios, and museums. The real challenge actually arises when people with completely differing methodologies are brought together from technologically advanced sciences and highly evolved arts and humanities fields, when people have to exchange not just their bodies of knowledge, not just translational, but they have to exchange their actual methods. They have to give each other methods with a view to dovetailing highly specialized disciplinary activities across huge intellectual divides. Enabling highly skilled people to teach each other new methodologies, facilitating the sharing of resources, buying out time to explore even which questions need answers and which problems need solving is essential. The results will not only produce the coveted new knowledge, but they're also going to go much farther and produce undreamed of and urgently needed new methodologies. So, how can we create the conditions conducive for this kind of work? First, we need to analyze and articulate the complementary aims and ambitions of science and of art. More than that, we also need to analyze the conditions in which both take place, unevenly matched conditions, which create complex collisions and confusions when brought together in interdisciplinary projects. This alone will take time, effort, and money. So where are we now? And what are the conditions of art-science interdisciplinarity currently, as they stand, and also what we can do to improve them? A bit of history will help us here. Many disciplines have their interdisciplinarity. It's the hallmark of late 20th century and the promise of the 21st. It may be, in fact, one of the few drives that spans both modernity and postmodernity. Artists' crossover experiments with film and video in the 1970s and 1980s are the foundation stone of media art, bringing self-reflexivity to everything from cinema to advertising and the internet. Biology and physics gave birth to biophysics, and so now we have X-ray crystallography, we have protein structure prediction. In the humanities, philology, linguistics, and literature have together given us semiotics. In each case, groundbreaking new methodologies emerged from adjacent fields too long kept apart. But what of the ultimate leap to be made in the methodological triangulation between the arts, the sciences, and the humanities? It must be made through seeing their complementarity, the continuity across their span, and then building the interstitial tissue across the divides through practice itself, both intellectual and pragmatic. Investigation, intervention, inquiry, analysis, critique, visualization, modeling, all these processes are present in scientific methodology, in the discipline of art, design, and aesthetics, and also in the methods of history and of philosophy. Following along these rich seams of practice, we can align the best of humankind's three great traditions of making, doing, and thinking. Current interdisciplinary practices and projects are showing us how to recognize in the crosshairs those ideas, issues, and realities we'd not actually even been able to acknowledge before. Some of these issues are so urgent, such as tackling climate change, that interdisciplinary practice has come to be seen as frontline in problem solving. This has sometimes led to interdisciplinarity receiving its greatest infrastructural support when operating in problem-solving mode around urgent questions. The obligation to produce an application of research findings, whether for commercial or altruistic reasons, is something which haunts science and turns those blue skies gray. Serious research questions at an experimental and methodological level are quickly reduced to other questions, such as, what are the outcomes? What does it do to improve life, health, security, the economy? What is the project's impact? Though not a problem per se, these questions should not be the only questions. This obsession with the applications of research is also built on a confusion between science and technology, where they get collapsed together, and there is an important difference. Crudely put, science is a method, and technology is an application of some findings of that scientific method. If we are to articulate the value of interdisciplinarity, it's vital not to confuse method with application or science with technology. And if you distinguish between those things, you're not going to get illustration. You're going to get real methodological alignment. Anyway, this distinction is true of fine art as well in a different register. There's a great deal more to fine art and artists than the art world with its commercial markets and museum blockbusters. And here today, we're speaking in a university, so I'm focusing on what a research institution can actually offer art science interdisciplinarities. Because universities, with their vast ranges of disciplinary talent, are better positioned than any other institution to develop transferable interdisciplinary methodologies. Whoops. In spite of the fact that larger scale infrastructure funding is rare for art science projects and often shackled to outcomes, there are many instances of scientists and artists coming together in exploratory projects. And when these are not funding-led shotgun weddings, they are usually instigated by highly skilled individuals, such as we have in this room, with enormous drive, who work on these projects in their precious spare time. It is collaborative work, yes, but the work takes place in relative isolation from each of the individual's peers, from other interdisciplinary project workers, and from the wider world. It can be, in short, lonely, and without a context commensurate with its real value and potential. There are a number of challenges which these individual interdisciplinary project members encounter. The first one is inherent. For there to be effective interdisciplinarity, there need to be highly skilled practitioners of differing disciplines. However, those who practice at least in one discipline extremely well are usually grounded and at home if they choose to foray out interdisciplinarily. They are capable of actually bending their discipline's rules and able to recognize the developed skills of another, even when they don't understand them. Learning one technique well also means one can acquire new skills more quickly. The problem is that this also means that everyone on a team will have widely differing skills and methods that are in large degree opaque to the other members of the team. People experience their own practice as second nature, and therefore both self-evident and invisible. Very fundamental project activities and scheduling issues will thus not even be tabled for discussion at the project's outset, because they are so deeply embedded in everything the individual practitioner says and does. This can lead to uneven expectations of each other, bad project management, bad schedule planning, limited knowledge exchange, projects which do not fulfill their full potential, frustration, and even anger and disillusionment. I wouldn't go so far as slaughter. Another challenge has to do with the uneven playing field between art and science in financial terms and in economic terms. Even a life sciences lab that is underfunded is in fact funded at levels of a much higher magnitude than that of the fine arts, including film and media. This is complex and has to do again with received notions of research versus application, as well as the highly codified articulation of scientific method and its aims, an articulation that has not yet fully been formed for fine art and aesthetics. These issues, which are essentially epistemological, are fundamental. Science seeks proof in the repeatable experiment which can reveal a fixed underpinning reality, physical, chemical, or biological. Art seeks proof in the singularity of subjectivity and in the capacity of that singularity to explore infinite variables of multiple realities, social, political, and cultural. So what I've said there is rather reductive, but there actually is truth in it, and both these quests are paramount. Instead of thinking of these aims and approaches as irreconcilable, i.e., one reduces variables, the other opens up to variables, instead of seeing these approaches as irreconcilable, we need to see them as complementary. How might they be made commensurate as well as complementary? We need to level a playing field so that the game can be played in its infinite complexity. Essentially, the case has been made for scientific method over the last 300 years. It has been spectacularly productive philosophically and in its discoveries. Science has been able to show the need for the sort of funding and infrastructure that it requires, and it has been awarded to a great extent. Things are different for fine art or dance, theater, literature, where there may be investment in the dissemination of research in the form of a performance or an installation, but rarely in the research and development phase, which is often effected speculatively and with little external financial investment. Even less so, the investment in understanding the method at the heart of this kind of knowledge production. If it has taken 300 years and huge investments of time and money in order to finesse and articulate a scientific method, would it not be wise to consider investing similar amounts of money and time in articulating large-scale issues in the arts and the humanities methodologies and in their fundamental value? Underinvestment in the project of culture and aesthetics has led to uneven development between the arts and the sciences. This has also forced huge difference in the basic economic models upon which they work. Science does not now start up research activities without front-end investment, and art often only sees a return on its necessarily speculative investment at the end of its research, when there's a product. This can mean that it's difficult to align resources in relation to cash flow, as well as to effect fundraising across various disciplines. In universities, budgeting across departments, both for cost and recovery of overheads, can be very difficult. Now we're getting to the pragmatic nitty-gritty. We need to think about these things. Managing the sharing of limited resources such as technologies and admin support, as well as other infrastructure, is complex across a campus. And yet, waste occurs in silos. Ineffective communication means shared interests are rarely identified. For real breakthroughs, it's agreed that joint appointments are essential, and yet nigh on impossible to effect. When they are instated, it often means 2 full-time jobs for the incumbent, whose work then falls between 2 stools because ref-based management of research is divided along disciplinary units of assessment and not along the lines of larger scale big questions that need to be addressed. This means a loss of identity and value, not only for the individual, but for the institution. And all these challenges were there even before the advent, in England at least, of the divisive and destructive nature of the withdrawal of tax funding for the teaching of arts and humanities. A further problem comes from the fact that with infrastructure comes bureaucracy, and science often labors under highly competitive conditions and almost unbearable scrutiny. It would surprise artists to know how difficult it is for scientists to access meaningful larger scale resources and instruments. For example, detector time on an X-ray telescope is lined up years in advance and is based on applications and peer judging that is incredibly exacting. So if it's not easy to share this kind of resource, this sort of infrastructure, even within the discipline, how much harder is it going to be to actually carve out time for something experimental that's going across boundaries with little funding behind it and unpredictable outcomes? Terminologies are also problematic. Sometimes one word will mean entirely different things in 2 fields where people are trying to work together. To a museum curator, the word artifact means an object produced by humankind as opposed to a naturally occurring object. In clinical medicine, an artifact can refer to a symptom that is produced by the treatment rather than by the disease being treated. In computer science, an artifact is an error that appears in data that has been mishandled by an algorithm. In philosophy and in anthropology, phenomenology is the study of the manifest structures of human consciousness and culture, often as products of sensory experience. In particle physics, phenomenology is an armature, often mathematical, for predicting experiments, a kind of active bridge between theory and experiment that draws together a number of disparate empirical observations coherently but provisorily. For cultural activists and theorists, the word media refers to any form of mass communication: newspapers, advertising, books, TV, film, mobiles, the net. To a biotechnologist, a medium is a kind of viscous liquid gel which has been primed to react in certain ways with biological samples that have been deposited in it. So in a way, you can see from this that even things that are potentially barriers are also potentially rather exciting bridges. But that's the conceptual and the individual level. This potential is actually rather less the case when it comes to barriers at institutional and bureaucratic levels. Indirect and overhead costs, as I said, are often unevenly distributed between university departments. The appointment of interdisciplinary talent falls between stools. Disciplines can also be tribal and competitive, meaning that peers have little respect for those who wander out of the village. Research councils and research assessment programs are not good at either funding or assessing truly interdisciplinary work. The research outcomes often take place outside of recognized quarters, in landscapes both real and virtual, which are far from the university itself. As many art science projects are carved out of existent infrastructures and funds that are actually created for other purposes, built on time freely given by people who believe in it, the resultant material comes to form a sort of diffuse diaspora. There's no way to capture the emergent methodologies and maximize them or transfer them. People are reinventing the wheel again and again. There's no overarching repository of these activities, no overview analysis of outcomes or taxonomization of activities, nor is there a structured peer evaluation system in place that has some sort of agreed benchmarks. There are few scholarly communities or journals where the epistemic value of this work is explored and crafted into new paradigms that move this important collective human endeavor forward. There's no across-the-boards professional reward, there's no kudos or of any real meaning for exploratory research in this kind of interdisciplinarity, yet. These larger scale problems are major impediments because they're also disincentives to even consider engaging in this field. And why the hell would anyone do it? Because it gives extraordinary satisfaction to contribute not only to several fields at once, but to expand the fields of human knowledge and practice. Collaboration and sharing of skills and knowledge and practice is among the most exalted form of human communion. It is a gift that we offer to each other, and then in turn we can offer the fruits to humankind. So, how are we going to go about actualizing the promise of these intellectual freedoms? To recap, we can foster art-science interdisciplinarity as artists and as scientists in some of the following ways. We need to actually articulate complementarity across the disciplines. We need to identify research questions which actually lie in this interstitial area. We need to foster commensurability by investing in an understanding of arts and humanities methodologies, and we need to then formulate them as transferable. We need to also instigate ways to value these collaborations in peer review structures, both in the art world and in science. And finally, we might also be able to pull a rabbit out of a hat. We can also address some of this in new ways, even under the financial challenges that we face. It may be possible to turn barriers into bridges and make a virtue of the otherwise catastrophic erosion of university funding in a global financial crisis. We can instigate sharing of everything immediately as antidotes to cuts. To put this into best practice, here are some suggestions for individual directors of research and vice chancellors. Listen carefully to what artists or scientists say they would like to do with you, even if it doesn't appear immediately to fit into anything you're working on. They could be right and trying to lead you somewhere new and exciting. Avoid instrumentalization of one discipline by another. Science is not an intellectual feeding ground, and humanities practitioners and artists are not just good communicators. Work with artists and scientists as respectfully as you would with other professional colleagues. Keep up to date with them and their work. Meet people. Don't just monitor the product in other fields. Develop long-term relationships and networks over time. Think about what you have to offer. Ideas, infrastructure, collections, funds, publishing, library, image resources, networks, and then offer it outside your field as you would to any other colleagues you respect. Identify subjects that have been historically considered difficult to explore, address, or resolve, and set up long-term research funding for them in order to sustain extended interdisciplinary think tanks. Involve people from other disciplines in structuring your own intellectual programs, your own experiments, and your own project development. Be flexible and informative as you would with any new colleague. So, for example, develop induction manuals for people who are not necessarily part of your field. And also pay those people who do not have salaries. That's quite important. When planning infrastructural upgrades, management workflows, and critical paths for projects, fold in advice on needs and practice from artists or from scientists, whichever is outside your field, and also the lessons that you've learned from them. If you can't set up larger structures, then work with what you have and find ways to creatively subvert or augment it, and at least regularly consult colleagues in other fields. When starting a project, begin with pre-project method sharing workshops. Show each other what amazing things can be done with your technique, your methods, your instruments. Discuss how they could be adapted to answer other questions. And, again, there's the issue of planning a project path. List fundamental activities and scheduling issues by individual discipline before making a fully ventilated interdisciplinary project plan. Map out for each other the critical path of your own practices and find ways to successfully dovetail these needs in each other's very pragmatic ways of working. Making time and space for each other's procedures and methods is important. Explain and explore terminologies to identify misunderstandings before they happen. And finally, be aware that whatever is worth doing will take years and years to develop, and that all collaborations will take some time to hit their stride, methodologically speaking. And it sounds like here you're in the middle of that. The great Michel Serres, in the 5th and final volume of his Hermès work, likened the paths between the arts, the sciences, and the humanities to the ever-shifting Northwest Passage. It is, he said, the great link between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans through the great Canadian North. It opens, closes, and twists all through the immense Arctic archipelago, all along a wildly complicated maze of gulfs and channels, of basins and of straits, between the islands of Banks and Baffin. One enters it by the Davis Strait, and one ends up in the Beaufort Sea. The voyage is arduous, the openings rare, and often blocked. Serres says, it is a difficult trajectory, hampered with encumbrances, a true labyrinth of earth, water, and ice, the very image of the crossing between the exact sciences and the human sciences. And it is not a path that is given once and for all. It must be built and discovered each time it is attempted. One wants to go everywhere, build a world where there is almost everything. Mathematics, biology, philosophy, painting. The Northwest Passage is, in the end, the project of one's entire life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Martha. Lots of interesting ideas there. Any questions? Angus?
So I have a sort of question framed as a comment, which is that virtually everything you said there, I can recognize within our own, in the science area, our own experience of building collaborations just between people that you would all label as scientists.
Yes.
I don't know whether we have so many shotgun weddings, but we have a great deal of marriages of convenience to bring together things which are done largely opportunistically, which nothing wrong with opportunism, but because we feel that that's responding to the only way we can get funding rather than what we really want to do. So I guess my comment is, do you think then that what we're discussing today is revealing something that there is any intrinsic difference between science and art or bringing them together, or that it's more just a more broad general issue within any large subject area of how you bring different groups of people together?
Well, I think what I've been trying to do is make the point that yes, there are generalities that have to do with people wanting to work together and starting to work together, but that until such time as we've actually fully ventilated what it is you do, how it is you do it, what is the economic model, what are the funding constraints in either, in a variety of areas, until such time as universities at a very high level are prepared to recognize and value joint appointments and the sort of bureaucratic impediments that there are, we're not going to get to the point where people are sitting down at a table and actually recognizing each other's methodologies as complementary. That is to say, for example, to take a medical example, if you're working in neuroscience, you might actually have something that is very important for a philosopher of who's working in consciousness has to say, and that same sort of continuous line, if it can be found, also might go through. We're going to see some performance projects this afternoon. Might actually have to do with something that the phenomenology of performance studies and performance activities can add on to that. So that if you are looking for a research question that actually ties these together and makes it possible to align those disciplines rather than just sort of meet at the interstitial places where someone has to translate someone else's work, then you're cooking. But we're not going to get there until there actually is an arena which is firmly recognized, funded, and people, the different ways in which people work are actually acknowledged. So it can't just be we're all in this together. We are, but let's take a few more really solid steps, pragmatic steps. Is that?
Yeah, no, I recognize that. I wonder whether at some point it comes down to talking about how one funds this, and whether that's a problem of the individual academic institutions and the people leading them, or their frustration at having to deal with the political masters who provide the money ultimately. Because you can have all the. I'm actually not one to contradict anything. I'm agreeing with you. It's just the frustration is how you implement it in practice when you have to find funding for it.
No, of course, and that's why I said at the beginning that even to do this is going to take time. It's not, but you have to start there, because otherwise you're going to come up against it again and again and again, and everyone is reinventing this wheel without actually finding a collective way in which, for even peer kudos are aligned, so that your VC says, yeah, we're going to do this because the president of the Royal Society has decided that this is, we've managed to convince him that he's going to go to the CST and he's going to go to BIS, and you have to do that. That's the point we're at. Otherwise, it will just be people sort of coming together for 6 weeks and going, I'm going to teach you how to, make a print, and then I'm going to teach you how to work a genomic sequencer, and in fact, no one will recognize that printing technology is at the core of, let's say, what feeds a microplate. It's the same technology, laser printing, and the actual feeds for microplates. It's the same technology. Can we look at that? Is that going to take us somewhere beyond just these sort of 6-week shotgun weddings? So.
Can I introduce a problem, I guess, into the conversation, which I think is probably something that it would be good to get out of the open early on in today's events. And I think it's something that sometimes gets termed as a class error, this idea of how one works across different data sets, and that sometimes things do not transfer terribly easily. And one of the things that concerns me is that within art, there is still a very, very strong argument that says that for something to aspire to the condition of art, it must be useless, and that uselessness is a fundamental characteristic of good art. Now, when we start to begin to address this notion of interdisciplinarity, I'm not quite sure I understand how that notion of uselessness that is valued within the arts community translates across into the kind of processes that we're addressing.
Well, I don't think that everyone would share that thought that art is useless.
I'm not
or
saying
that art's.
I was very careful in that. I said actually it's not something that everybody shares, but it is still a very, very strong characteristic of what conditions the notion of good art.
Well, in a way, that was what I was talking about when I said if we spent 300 years actually articulating the value and finessing what scientific method is, we have not spent 300 years actually looking at the incredible complexity of a practice that absorbs, engenders, and embraces variability as the very core of its activity, and that is what cultural production is about. It is about subjectivity and about actually producing and receiving subjective experiences. It's not, well, this is one of the things that it's about, but we have not actually, the project of aesthetics, for example, philosophy of aesthetics, has gone some way to actually articulating the value and the methods of that. But when people tell you the basic function, or one of the important things about art is that it is useless, i.e. it doesn't have an application, which I think is sort of what we're talking about here. It is because it moves into the intimate nature of the experience of a work of art, and it also moves into a theoretical void. That is to say, it has not been understood methodologically as fundamentally as scientific method has been understood. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have this problem, where people think that art and cultural production is useful when it has no use function. That is to say, it's at its best when it is without application. But it's only because the application has not been articulated fully, and that's our next 300 years. So, is that helpful? Or?
I think it's more fundamental than that, because I think
more fundamental even than that.
Well, I think what's wrapped up in that in your statement is the fact that it is a problem that can be resolved, and I suppose what I'm saying is that I'm not sure it can, and that maybe what we need to do is rest in the space where scientific methodology is fantastic and significant and important. Artistic practice is fantastic and significant and important. There will be crossovers, but the crossovers have to operate on the terms that are most fundamental to those areas of operation. And that may produce the kind of class errors that I think I started off that statement with. But I don't think those class errors can be overcome. I think they should be celebrated and explored in the way we actually celebrate and explore diversity. But actually, I don't think they can be resolved.
Well, I don't actually agree with you, but because I actually believe in the human capacity of self-reflection and the ability we have to actually understand what it is we're doing when we're doing it. actually articulating that and showing the value of that is a very different is different between the arts and the sciences, of course. That doesn't mean that it can't be done or that it shouldn't be done, in my opinion. But that's okay. Lots of scientists disagree about the nature of scientific method as well. So.
I was going to say, kind of within the spectrum of art and then within the spectrum of science, like you had mentioned the university being specifically like a more research environment. It's not like every scientist is going to want to pair with artists, but there are those Venn diagram kind of like areas in between, and it doesn't have to be everyone, but I certainly imagine there's quite a difference between artists who want to go show in London and be at galleries and big shows is not for everyone, and so like I think I feel good about the talk.
I'm not sure, and I could be way off the mark and this may not make any sense at all, but I could link your two opinions together somehow with, dare I say it, a psychedelic trip. Basically.
Self-experimentation.
Okay, yep. For instance, suicidal DMT, you know, you may have a trip and go, my God, I am suffering from astonishment. What is happening here? And once you come out of this, there is a self-reflection though. There is, maybe perhaps you don't quite understand something, but some sort of information has come through and the self-actualization and that development, that process has come through for maybe self-betterment or, my God, I'm never taking that ever again. But saying that, even though perhaps you may not understand something like art and say perhaps like a muse, the result of that uselessness or that, you know, that non-comprehensible muse can result into something that's understandable and something that we can create to a betterment society, maybe.
So you want to look up a guy named Nick Langlitz, who's an historian of science who's been working on self-experimentation projects between people, scientists, chemical and pharmaceutical scientists working in this area, and humanities practitioners, and also some artists.
Okay, what's his name, sorry?
Nick Langlitz.
How you spell his last name?
Langlitz. And the important thing for me is also to see a triangulation with the humanities, because there are fields of extremely robust and rigorous research in the humanities that are self-reflexive and that can actually help us tie together in ways that make things solid. So phenomenologists, philosophers, and so on, we need them as well.